For those that we haven't met yet, I'm Ezgi Kaya. I graduated from Autonoma in 2014. And that was the first year that this Barcelona BGSE PhD Jamboree was held. I'm very excited. We have recently started this project with my co-author. For some of you, she is also a familiar name, Efrosini Adamapoulou, who is in Bank of Italy now, who was a visiting student in Autonoma in 2012, 2013. That's how we met, and we started to work together. And we are still working together. So this is a great opportunity for you to meet your future co-authors. This is a great community. And back then, in 2014, I was thinking, why didn't we have this before? And now I'm here presenting my work. So thanks a lot to Anas and Jose for organizing. And please, on my behalf, say thank you to Ana Ventura, who helped me a lot with the logistics. And thank you all for attending to this session. The main idea of this paper came from basically theoretical macro models and the macroeconomic evidence. So, I mean, after 60 years, we are still discussing the implications, testing the empirical implications of the life cycle permanent income model. And one of the implications that's related to our study is that consumption, household consumption should respond to changes that are unanticipated and those that the consumer is uncertain. So this is kind of an unanticipated permanent income shock or kind of another variable that you are not really certain about. Yeah? If you assume that people are forward-looking and they smooth their consumption over time, you may perfectly think also the time period that you will have a certain income should matter from the perspective of households. Yeah? So, keeping this in mind, we also know that it's not always income, it's also the measured political events that sometimes introduce uncertainty to the economy. They don't really need to have implications in terms of the household budget. They may have implications about uncertainty about the periods that you will receive a certain income. All right? So we know that at the aggregate consumption responds to the uncertainty introduced by the measured political events or economic events as well. However, when you look at the microdata evidence, we don't have so many examples. These are the 3 recent examples that are kind of similar to what we do, but they are looking at different measure events that happen in different countries. We will look at the European Union from the title, as you understand. Yeah? So the very first paper is about Germany, and what they look at is the 1998 German general election. So the political uncertainty introduced by the political election. So the idea of that paper is that, so that's the election that's closest to the post-war period, and there are some candidates that are offering completely different packages when they are campaigning. And those policies are related to unemployment benefits and pensions. And the authors use this election as a natural experiment, and they look at the uncertainty introduced by this political event. How do they measure uncertainty? Well, they use the German SOEP. Yesterday we heard a lot about it. There's a forward-looking question about the uncertainty, and they look at the fraction of people who thought things are uncertain in the economy before and after the election. Okay? And since the candidates differ in terms of the unemployment benefits and the pension packages they offer, they compare everyone else with civil servants before and after. Because civil servants tend to have secure jobs, they are not under risk in terms of unemployment and pensions. So they have a simple defensive strategy, they have a control group. It's arguable whether it's a perfect control group or not. But what they find is that actually household behavior changes during this uncertain period. And no surprise, savings increase, precautionary behavior. They don't analyze consumption, but they argue that this might be due to a decrease in consumption or an increase in labor supply. And they look at the labor supply side only. Okay? The second paper is about China. another major event that happened in Beijing in May 1989 after the death of a political leader. And riots start, student riots, and they claim that this introduced a lot of uncertainty. And how do they measure uncertainty? Well, they look at the newspapers. They collect the number of times that the word uncertainty was mentioned about Beijing during that period, and they show that there was an increase before and after these riots. And basically they do a diff and diff again because there might be a seasonal effect in this increase from April to May, so they look at also 1 year after April, May, a simple setup. Why I'm explaining this in detail? Because we will do something very similar. We will do a difference in differences, but I would like you to understand, first, it's important to determine that there's an uncertainty, resolution, or an increase in uncertainty. Second, you need a control group who shouldn't be affected by this uncertainty. Third, you need a measure event, okay? The last paper is about Spain, the impacts of the Great Recession. So, Great Recession introduced high unemployment. So, there is no direct impact on the income for the sample that they look, but people are uncertain about the periods that they will have a certain income. So, the unemployment probability is higher during the Great Recession. I think the uncertainty introduced by the Great Recession is clear enough. So, I will not discuss a lot about the economics of immigration. Why should we care? What is the impact of immigrants in the host economy? Why consumption is important? If you think about 2/3 of GDP is the household consumption, I will not try to convince you in this group of people. Okay, I will directly start why we look at immigrants. As you already sense, we will use the EU enlargement as a natural experiment. And we think that the immigrants face higher uncertainty in the host country compared to natives, okay? So that's why we will not try to measure uncertainty like some others did. They were trying to prove us that there was an increase in the uncertainty. We will not do that here. The EU enlargement, we will use it not an increase in uncertainty, as a resolution of uncertainty for the immigrants that are residing in the host country. So when their country access to the EU, the uncertainty will disappear for those immigrants. And why we think that uncertainty, I mean, there's a resolution in uncertainty. First, if you're an illegal immigrant, you are automatically legalized. You have access to credit markets, you can get a credit card, you can consume more, and etc. And on top of it, you can find a job as well. And for those who were already legally residing in the country, now they have better employment opportunities and potentially higher income too. Yeah? So that's why we see the EU as an empirical proxy for the resolution of uncertainty for immigrants that are residing in a European Union country. All right, so what we do is that we look at whether the EU enlargement in 2007 affected the consumption behavior of immigrant households that were already present in Italy before. We are not looking at this new wave of immigrants before the enlargement. So they should be already residing in Italy, and now their country access to the EU. What happens to their consumption? That's what we do. Yeah? And for those who are not familiar with the EU history, they are Romanians and Bulgarians. And as I said, we will treat the enlargement as a natural experiment and compare the monthly consumption of immigrant households that were already in Italy that come from newly accessed candidate countries before and after the EU enlargement. Okay? Yes?
At some point you mentioned illegal immigrants.
Yes.
And so are you measuring consumption for illegal immigrants? Or are you considering, I mean, immigrants that
Can I postpone this question when I come to the data we talk about it? Is that all right? But the answer is yes, I have illegal immigrants in my data too. Okay? The answer is yes, but we do a bit more with this legal status so that we want to see whether all the effect is driven by illegal immigrants or not. We try to do our best with the data we have, but I would like to discuss that part more with you because it's very preliminary, that part especially. Okay? All right, so as you already pointed out, actually the 2007 EU enlargement was not a surprise. I mean, here on this slide, I say Italy is a great context, right? Because we had already quite a few Romanians and Bulgarians before, because that's what we want to look at. Although in 2007, the numbers, I think, tripled when you look at the number of people that come from Bulgaria and Romania. So we have enough people already in Italy. So they are a significant group in Italian immigrant population. And Italy provides a great context in this setting because after their country access to the EU, Romanians and Bulgarians unexpectedly acquired full rights to work in Italy. Why I say unexpectedly? Because, of course, as Andrei mentioned, this was not a surprise. I mean, in 2004, their accession negotiations with the EU was concluded, and the date was certain. In 2007, these two countries were becoming EU members. However, the majority of member states, including Italy, imposed interim restrictions in order to guard their labor market against disruption by Romanians and Bulgarians. So they restricted their access to the labor markets. Why I say Italy is a great context? Because 3 days before the EU enlargement, so the sectors that they removed the restrictions were mostly dominated by Romanians and Bulgarians. In addition to that, the remaining sectors, basically only manufacturing, they changed also the quotas for Bulgarians and Romanians. So in practice, they accessed full rights to work in Italy 3 days before the EU enlargement.
And did they also change the rules for other migrant groups except the...
No.
Okay.
This is just due to the enlargement.
Mm-hmm. They might have changed the...
Yeah. Okay. All right. Any other question? So,
Yeah, sorry.
yes, please.
Do you have any pre-migration characteristic? Just because I think that for those that migrate after 2007 was easier to go to Italy.
Yeah.
So it might be a different and larger pool than the one who succeed to move when it wasn't that easy because they weren't in the European Union.
In 2 slides.
Okay.
Yeah, you are talking about the selection issue because the new immigrants from these countries would be potentially different than the others that were already residing in Italy. We don't look at those ones. So for avoiding the selection issue due to the EU enlargement, because this is basically a treatment, right? Treatment would change the composition of the treatment group. That's the idea that Lavinia is pointing out. We exclude them from the sample to avoid this selection issue. Yeah, because the treatment would affect only the treatment group's composition. We don't expect an effect in our control group's composition due to the issue that you raised, so we exclude them from the sample. But it's coming too. All right. So that's why we think that this was an unanticipated resolution of uncertainty in the labor market of Italy for Romanians and Bulgarians. Okay? That's why we don't try to measure uncertainty, looking at the newspaper articles or so. We are more close to the Spanish paper about the Great Recession in that sense that we think that uncertainty was resolved by the EU access.
Were firms expecting this to some extent? I mean, I understand maybe it would be unexpected from the perspective of workers, but if firms know it and then the workers have networks, you know, you are living in a country, you talk to your legal friends that work for some firms, and the employer tells you that, you know, but there is this rumor that
Italy will lift the restrictions and...
maybe firms, big firms already know this. Because that's a law that usually gets passed right before New Year's Eve. Nobody's looking at the newspapers, but just people that are not going to be affected probably don't really read.
So maybe it's not that unexpected. That's
no,
how
I
it's.
mean, there is some.
I'm like you. I'm like you. I was not believing that. That's why we did some robustness checks. We looked at immigrants that arrived even before, like before 2006, before 2005, to see whether that does an impact. Even before 2004, to see whether before they knew they would enter to the EU. If you look at those immigrants, but of course you are reducing the sample in that case, right? You are looking at smaller and smaller sample with really like long-term immigrants. So that's why today I will show you in robustness checks. I think I put one of those because when Jose told me it's 1 hour, 15 minutes, I had some robustness checks, but that's also what we try to address. Yeah, and actually, so I didn't tell you, but this is the first time I'm presenting this work, and my co-author presented it yesterday, first time, like my first presentation, but the paper was presented first time in Italy, in Rome. And one of the audience mentioned that actually in June there was a rumor about this. That's why I think those robustness checks, you may see them as our benchmark estimates later. So things may change, but we do that too. And you will see that the results are pretty much similar. So let's go back to the control group discussion. As I said, we will do difference in differences. So we will look at before and after 1st of January 2007. We will look at average household expenditure on consumption items in broad categories and in total. We will look at Romanians and Bulgarians, and as a control group, we look at the people, immigrants, that are residing in Italy, but they are from candidate countries. Although it sounds cool, we are not the first one that thought the EU as a natural experiment and used this control group before. Giovanni Masterboni and Pinotti, they also use the EU enlargement to understand the effects of immigrants on crime rates, and they use the same control group. Because ideally, if you think about it, these, if they are members, if they are candidate countries and they are kind of eligible to become member states in the future, they should have similar economic conditions back at home. That's the idea that we also use. However, in our data, we don't have anyone from Iceland living in Italy, okay, in our sample, and only a few Turkish people. All right, so, and actually that's good for us because we were thinking Iceland and Turkey may not be that similar to Romania and Bulgaria, although we know that Albania, for instance, is a comparable control group. So I'm not so sad that we don't have anyone from Iceland. This panel A of this figure is our starting point. Panel A shows the average monthly household expenditure on consumption goods for immigrants from Romania and Bulgaria that were already residing in Italy and from the immigrants from the candidate countries. So this is our main identification strategy. So we claim that before the EU enlargement, trends were parallel. And after the EU enlargement in 2007, we see an increase in the household consumption of Romanians and Bulgarians, but we don't see the same increase for immigrants that are coming from candidate countries. So when we saw this, the very first thought that I had was exactly what you said. It must be the household size, they just invite their parents, spouse, whatever, come, and that's a very mechanical thing, isn't it? Number of people are increasing, of course the household consumption will increase, yeah? That's why we try to take into account those factors, yeah, so that this is not driven only by these mechanical things, yeah? Maybe that's a good point to talk about the data. So the data set that we use is a non-governmental organization, Institute for Multi-Ethnical Studies, ISMU, collects a data set. This data set has been used quite a bit by economics of immigrant literature, because not only it includes legal immigrants, it also includes illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants. And the good part about this study is that they collect individual level information. They collect household level information that we can take into account, this kind of household size, number of children, etc. And also, from 2004 to 2012, they asked the immigrants their consumption in broad categories. So on average, how much do you spend in a month on food, clothes, and other basic needs, on housing, and on other items such as leisure, transportation, so less basic needs, yeah? This data set is collected for a particular region of Italy, so Italians can tell me more, but my information is that Lombardy region, where this data is collected, is one of the wealthiest, richest, and the attraction point for immigrants, and the immigrants in this region counts for the 25% of the total immigrant population in Italy. So that's why we are confident of using this data and draw implications about the impact of the EU enlargement on these Romanians and Bulgarians in Italy overall. Okay?
My question was about why didn't you choose a possible as a control group, which would be the people from Eastern European countries that already gained access to the European Union, like the Czech Republic or Poland, Slovakia, that was 2004? Because this group seems that it's less at risk or in maybe less competition.
Less heterogeneous, you mean? Yeah.
Because the ones that don't have legal rights to stay could be worried that now these Romanians can legally come and get a job on the fields or wherever they're working. So.
Yeah, that's something that actually so that's how we started. We were basically using everyone else, all other immigrants, and now we were thinking like, well, this is a very heterogeneous group, so let's use just Albanians, who are rather similar to Romanians and Bulgarians. And then when we saw Giovanni and Pinotti's paper, we were like, all right, this is also a control group that has a large number of observations and so on. But definitely you're right, as a robustness check, definitely we should show the results with, and we haven't replicated all the results again for different groups, but I think it's an extension that we should include in the paper. Okay. So this is the data we will use, and of course we aggregate these three items and we look at the total consumption first, and then we look at whether this increase that we observe also happens in all categories, or is it just one of the broad categories is driving the result or not. So, for the issues that we discussed, we restrict our sample to immigrants that arrived to Italy before 2007 as the benchmark. And then we try different robustness checks for people that arrived even earlier, avoiding this selection and the composition effects. And we also restrict people that arrived to Italy no more than 10 years before the EU accession. Because if you are living in Italy for 10 years, you can become a citizen. So the impact that we identify may not be the treatment effect. It may be because they just become citizens and they spend more, okay? So we want to avoid that. We want to make sure that these people are not gaining citizenship by the time of the EU enlargement. I already showed my figure, but let's look at the other panels too. Those are the broad categories. So the second one on the top is the food, clothing, and other basic needs. We kind of see a similar figure. So we were thinking that this is the one that's driving total consumption, but also in other items also we see an increase. Other items meaning leisure, transportation, less basic items. But although it's hard to claim before 2005 these trends are parallel, we don't see much in housing, all right? So these figures are already telling you what we will find. And due to the reasons that you mentioned, we don't just do a simple definitive, so we don't only compare without conditioning on anything. We control for some other characteristics to see whether those are the things that are driving this increase, okay?
Housing is not surprising. You will not necessarily overhaul
Exactly. That's what we are thinking. Housing expenditure, it's not like, oh, today the restrictions are now removed. Oh, 3 days later, we are now the EU members. Okay, I'm going to buy a house on 2nd of January. So that's why we are not very surprised about, because housing is a big investment that takes time. And we are not surprised with this finding as well. Yeah. So the individual controls, things that we think that are relevant in terms of the household consumption. Age, sex, education level, and we also control for years of residence in Italy because you are getting closer to become a citizen and so on. Things may matter. And we have some household characteristics that we were worried about, the things that you mentioned. So whether you have a spouse abroad in your home country, whether you have children still living there and you have children here, so whether you change your fertility behavior or whether your children come. So due to these things, we control for household composition characteristics. And all right, failures. We should mention the failures, right? In the data, we don't have income. So we would like to ideally condition on income and find a good instrument for this income variable, which we don't do because we don't have. The best we can do is we have home ownership variable that should proxy income. In addition to that, we have labor income of the respondents. Of course, this is not the household income. And if the person is not working, this labor income is 0. But what we did is like, after 2011, after the EU enlargement, they start to ask also the household gross income. So we have this variable in later years, which is pretty useless for us. But what we do is like we look at the correlation between the labor income and the household income. And the correlation coefficient between those two was kind of 0.28. So we were thinking, all right, so maybe if we condition on this variable also, at least, I mean, we don't have income, we try to do our best. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay? So, all right, this is the specification. What we do is that we forget about the permanent income hypothesis. We forget about the long-term trends. We first look at the immediate effect that we see on that figure, okay? So we look at the 2007, 2006. This is before and after. Romanians and Bulgarians and other immigrants from candidate countries. So that's the coefficient delta. Yeah? Condition on individual characteristics, household characteristics, and some fixed effects, that because people living in Milan might be different than people living in another province of Lombardy. And a country of origin, because we still have variation in our control and treatment group. So this is what we do. This will give us the short-term effect of EU enlargement on Romanians and Bulgarians living in Italy. And we estimate 4 separate regressions for total consumption first, and then the broad category. So our dependent variable changes. Okay?
Wouldn't also control like big city versus rural place be interesting to have?
Definitely interesting, I think so. We do that too. No, you're right, because we were thinking that maybe the ones that are living in big city so are kind of facing higher bureaucracy costs when they need to renew their permits and so on. And with the EU enlargement, we expect them to be affected more because that cost disappears from their budget. Yeah, we were thinking maybe there should be a heterogeneous impact. We don't find that. But kind of province fixed effects should take care of it here in this specification, but for the heterogeneous effects, we don't find anything. Okay? You're not convinced?
No, I mean, within the province, you have a big city, but you also have small other towns around the big city, so I don't think that.
Urban-rural type of thing you have in mind. What we do is Milan, outskirts of Milan. That's what we do. That's kind of urban-rural.
I guess most of migrants are in big cities anyway. They are not in rural places.
I mean, we had enough observation in terms of the outside Milan outskirts. It kind of corresponds to your urban-rural connection. But our province variable, I'm not sure whether it's that in detail, village versus center. I don't think that it was that detailed, but we try to take care of it. All right, so the total consumption. So from first column to the fourth, what we do is we basically start by just controlling for fixed effects. We start to add the other variables step by step, starting from the individual controls, then household controls, and the last one also controls for labor income. Okay? Why we leave it separate? Because potentially the EU enlargement also would affect the labor income for individuals. So that's why, but you will see that third and fourth column are not that different at the end. So I'm confident to show those results. So anything else that I should say? Okay, if we take the fourth column, what you would interpret there is the increase in the consumption of Romanians and Bulgarians by the EU enlargement is around 9%. Yeah, that's what we find. That's the increase that we see on the graph, conditional on characteristics. Food, clothing, and other basic needs, similar figure. I just report here the relevant coefficients, but basically my definitive coefficient is the coefficient of the interaction term. That's the one that I'm looking at. And the effect that we find is around 0.077, meaning 8% increase again. Quite similar to the total increase in the total consumption. So it seems like food and clothing is very similar to total consumption. Nothing in housing. An impact also in other items such as leisure, transportation, less basic items, even stronger, higher, greater than total consumption and basic needs. Okay?
How many years are you doing? So the data is yearly consumption, or you have like the...
Each year, they ask to individuals. So this is not a panel data, by the way. This is repeated cross-section, yearly survey, but asking monthly consumption expenditure, average monthly consumption expenditure. Okay?
And you're including until like all the other years in your sample? Or?
At the moment, what we are looking at is the short-term effect. So just before and after, 2007 and 2006. Okay? So that's what we are looking at. And what's next is, so this is basically the summary. Maybe related to what you say, we were thinking, are these effects persistent? So we started all this project thinking that permanent income hypothesis, is this effect persistent or not? A method to deal with it also would allow us to test our parallel trends assumption is the author's leads and lags method. So what you do, basically, you introduce the interaction of each year dummy with your treatment group. Yeah? And you look at the coefficient of each term, and for the years that are before the treatment, you expect those coefficients to be 0 if the parallel trends assumption is satisfied. For the year of the enlargement, for 2007, that's the short-term effect that I showed you, but now we have a larger span of data, and we are controlling for other year effects and so on, and we want to look at, again, the contemporaneous effect. And for the later years, we look at whether this effect is persistent or not. Yeah? Let me show you just the figure of it. Yeah? Forget about all those numbers. This figure presents you the point estimates for the interaction term of each year with 95% confidence interval, where the standard errors are two-way clustered standard errors, because we cluster at two province and country of origin level, so we use the two-way clustered standard errors. And the first panel is again total consumption. The broad categories of consumption are shown also in other panels. The vertical red line is the EU enlargement. So the main effect happens in 2007. In 2008, 2009, we still find a positive coefficient, but we can't reject that this coefficient is insignificant. But then in later years also we have this difference significant. So at least we can say that this effect doesn't fan out. So it still exists, but I'm not very confident to say that we found evidence of the permanent income hypothesis here. So we look at labor markets because that's one of the channels we think that maybe after the EU enlargement, these people are more likely to find jobs. They are more likely to receive higher salaries. And we were also thinking maybe they are more likely to find permanent jobs, which basically is kind of consistent with the permanent income hypothesis if that is the case, because the periods that you have a certain income is now longer compared to a temporary employment. And if the consumption effect is driven by this channel, we could claim that we provide empirical evidence for the hypothesis. Yeah? That's what we do here. We estimate a similar regression, yearly interactions. We don't control for the household characteristics here. We just control for the things that we think they are relevant for the labor market outcomes, individual characteristics and fixed effects. And we look at these outcomes, and that's what we find. We find an increase in the fraction of people that are working with a permanent contract. So the probability of employment with a permanent contract increases with the EU enlargement. So we are thinking that's one of the channels. We find an effect also on wages, but bear in mind this excludes people that are out of labor force. So we are talking about a subsample of people that I showed you the increase in consumption. Okay? So that's not everyone. So a short-lived labor force participation effect right after the accession, but no employment effect. But we were thinking that, I mean, these are the immigrants, so for the legal ones, the only way that they can become legal is almost work permit, so they are already employed. Even the illegal ones are more likely to, I mean, they are likely to work in the shadow economy already before the enlargement. So we were not that surprised in terms of no effects in terms of employment and labor force participation, but in line with our expectations, we find an effect on wages and on the probability of permanent employment. Yeah? So we are thinking this is potentially one channel. The second channel might be maybe related to your question, Alessandro, is the legalization. So automatically, with the EU enlargement, illegal immigrants become legal. And Christian Dassman, Francesco Fassani, and their co-author, they have a paper showing that actually legal status is an important determinant of the consumption of immigrants. They show that illegal immigrants consume 40% less compared to legal immigrants. And if you think that the EU enlargement automatically legalizes these illegal immigrants, the increase that we see may not be the treatment effect, it may be basically the effect of the legalization, basically, because the treatment effect is another factor that's related to consumption. Okay? So that's why we repeat our short-term analysis restricting the sample to people that were already legally residing in Italy by the time of the EU accession. So these are legal immigrants. This is the short-term effects figure. We don't find an effect on basic needs. We find an effect for these legal immigrants on basically less basic items. The increase in the consumption is driven by the increase in their expenditure on leisure, transportation, and so on. So if you think about these people were not liquidity constrained, these were already legal working immigrants, we are not surprised to find this result. Yeah, this is consistent with what we were expecting. The only thing is that why just short term? So you will see that we also look at their labor market outcomes. We find nothing. Okay, so these are legal immigrants already working. We don't find an effect on their wages and probability of having a permanent contract. No effect. This was puzzling for us. What you would like to look at is also the long-term effects. Failure, again. We can't do that. This is not a panel data. They are not asked their former legal status. How we are able to do 2007 and 2006 is also a bit tricky. What we look at, so in Italy, apparently, if you have a work permit, it lasts for 2 years. Yeah? So in 2007, when they were asked their legal status and what type of work permit they hold, they kept answering what they were still holding on their possession. So, but in the later years, you see that this is disappearing, after 2009 especially, because if you just received it, it expires in 2 years, so you don't have it anymore and you don't need it anymore. So that's why we are not able to look at the long-term effects after 2007, okay? We were not very convinced, so we kept on looking. We looked at social security data too, to see whether there's a labor market impact. So, because if these guys' consumption is increasing, there can be two things. Either they are decreasing their savings, or they are changing their labor market, I don't know, supply, or their wages is increasing. There must be something going on. That was our idea. So this is a very preliminary work, as I'm saying. So now I'm going to show you the social security data figures, which we try to make that sample quite similar to what we have in the ISMU data. So we looked at people that are working in Lombardy firms that already exist in the social security survey before the EU enlargement, so not more than 10 years experience and so on. So we try to make the sample quite similar. Wages, nothing. Again, the same control and treatment groups, okay? No impact on wages. However, what we find is an increase in the fraction of people that are working with a permanent contract 1 year after, with a delay. Still, we are not sure. Our interpretation of this is that it takes time. The conversion from temporary to permanent, there might be some bureaucratic procedures associated, so it comes with a delay. And if people are forward-looking, and if they are smoothing their consumption over time, and they know that they will be moving to a permanent contract from their current temporary contract, these are all legal, they would increase their consumption already in 2007. But as I'm saying, open to discussion, yeah? Some robustness checks. I want to leave 5 minutes at least to the discussion. So I will not discuss, because when you highlighted the issues, I told you what else we do. So 1 year before the enlargement, so before 2006, because before 2005, those results are here, but I think you will believe me that we find similar effects. We look at, by the equivalent scale, look at the individual consumption, whether there's an impact, or the household consumption is driven by the household composition that we can't control for. We don't find anything different. We look at Milan versus outside to understand whether there are heterogeneous effects. We don't find. We are also looking a little bit now what's happening with the children, you know, whether, because when you look at the descriptive figures, there's an increase in the number of children, not the children that come from their country of origin, it's the number of children they have. Here we control for it, so I'm not too worried about the current results, but we want to see whether this can be the mechanism somehow. Maybe I leave it here and open the discussion. There were a few things that I postponed. I hope I addressed that you mentioned, but I haven't addressed your question. As I'm saying, potentially in the labor market, we would expect spillover effects, because the claim is that the new immigrants that are coming from Romania and Bulgaria with the EU accession are not competing with our control group, rather they are competing with our treatment group. Then you would expect not an increase in their wages, right? You would expect something completely opposite to what we find if we would observe spillover effects, at least in the labor market. Our findings are not really telling us that that's the direction to go, but maybe if you have suggestions, yeah.
To me, it's not really clear which way the effect would go in the first place.
I see. So they may find better jobs, like in that sense.
Which way the effect would go.
I see. Yeah, yeah, I see.
That there might be some interaction. And then the other, but I don't know if this matters, but also this policy change also shows that Italy in a way is more open for this type of immigration. So that can also change the expectations of Albanians to in the future expect a high probability of also gaining that access to.
Yeah, but you don't see any increase in their consumption. I think if that it was the case, you would expect a change in their consumption behavior, which we don't. But I think in the sense of, you're right, I missed that point. The spillovers can go either way, so it's worth exploring a bit. So now we are at a stage that for legals, we would look at social security data more for looking at these long-term trends, because in ISMU data, this is what we can do. But definitely it worth checking the uncertainty measures. And if you have any further questions, suggestions, comments, I'll be happy to take them. Okay. As I said, like anything that you kind of think is going on, please let's talk during the coffee break. And thanks again for coming and inviting me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments.